Yes, Sunita ji, please go ahead.
Good morning in the States and good evening in India. It's an honor to
Good
be in
evening, good morning.
Good evening. It's an honor to be in conversation with Mr. Anil Nauriya. Anil Nauriya is an economist by training, has been a counsel at both the Delhi High Court and Supreme Court of India since the 80s. He has written widely on history and politics, and his books address Gandhi in Africa, Acharya Narendra Deva, W. Pearson, and other figures associated with the freedom struggle in the first half in India in the first half of the 20th century. I was fortunate enough, like many of you, I'm sure, to listen in on Mr. Nauriya's recent conversation with Professor Raj Mohan Gandhi on Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan and Vallabhbhai Patel. And this conversation, the one we're having now, was scheduled because many friends wanted to learn more about Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, also known as Bad Shakhan, and the Khudai Kidmatgars, the original ones, and also the movement today. I am Sunita. I'm a US-based human rights activist and co-founder of Hindus for Human Rights. Faisal Khan is not only the national convener of Khudai Kidmatgar and on the executive committee of the Socialist Party of India, he's the person who revived this movement, Khudai Kidmatgar, for peace and communal harmony in 2011. But he's also an advisory board member of my organization, Hindus for Human Rights. Faisal Bhai's arrest for doing namaz in a Hindu temple was devastating to us in Hindus for Human Rights for so many reasons. Because one, he's part of us, part of our organization. Because also we can't accept that prayer can ever be a crime. And because this was yet another instance of the targeting of an Indian Muslim. We have recently, in the last day, heard some good news that Faisal Bhai's lawyer, Mr. Colin Gonsalves, has successfully argued for him to be given bail. He was denied the first 2 times, and Faisal Bhai has been in jail. He's still in jail in Mathura. It's been 7 weeks now. And so I'm thrilled to have some good news, first of all, and also this morning in New Mexico, where I am, to have this opportunity to learn from Mr. Anil Nauriya about Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, Bad Shakhan, and the original Khudai Kidmatgars and their relevance in today's India and the world. So I'm just going to launch right in and ask my first question to Anilji. Can you tell us about the man, Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, or Bad Shakhan? Who was he, and how did he come to devote his life to Hindu-Muslim unity and non-violent resistance?
Well, first of all, let me clarify that I'm an inquirer like anyone else. And I am also learning through these opportunities to speak to you. And because of these opportunities, I've been reading and picking up things. I'm familiar with the history of Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan from this side of the border. Not so familiar with his history on the other side of the border once India got partitioned in 1947. So that we learn largely from what we read or hear. But to start with his life as we recall it in India, in present-day India, he was always looked upon. I was brought up on, to look upon Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan as one of the titans of our freedom movement. That is the freedom movement of the undivided country. And, it's startling to read about the kind of privations he was subjected to during the freedom struggle and also after. Some facts about him are not very widely known, One is that even his father, Behram Khan, who was 90 years old at the time in 1919, was arrested along with Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan. So, he belonged to a rebellious tradition, but rebellious in a constructive way, without resorting to violence. And he said at some point that he learned his non-violence from the Islamic tradition, you know. And when Gandhiji came up on the scene and brought up these issues, he took to them like a duck to water, as it were. Uh, Although he met Gandhiji in person only in the 20s, later 1926, 27, 28, he had been present in early 1920 at a conference in Delhi, which Gandhiji had also attended. And those were the lead-up conferences, which the conferences prior to the launching of the non-cooperation movement, whose centenary we will be observing now. Um, you know, in the last week of December this year, it will be 100 years since the endorsement of the non-cooperation resolution by the Indian National Congress at its full session in Nagpur in 1920. And that had a great influence on Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan. His life was, even prior to that, geared towards social reform. And one thing that is sometimes forgotten because of because he set up this organization called Khudai Kidmatgars, which sounds religious because it refers to Khuda, but it's not as though Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan was an orthodox religious person in that sense. In fact, in his autobiography, he is very critical of priesthood, of the equivalent of priesthood in any religion. So even about his own religion. He, in fact, is a rebel against the kind of traditional education that was being imparted in his part of the country. And he refers to that repeatedly in his autobiography. He set up, along with his associates, a chain of schools in Utmanzai, around where he was born, And that chain of schools later was expanded with the non-cooperation movement, because one of the objects of non-cooperation was to boycott government schools, government educational institutions, and set up what were known as national schools. That is, schools set up on behalf of the national movement, which would be independent of government and which would not even take any aid from the government. And the setting up of these schools was also resented by the government. So that was one of the reasons for his second arrest, which took place in 1921, on the establishment of some of these schools. That was an added reason, his participation in the constructive activities related to non-cooperation. As time proceeded, he became more and more active in these matters. and plunged deeply into the civil disobedience movement of 1930. And that was a time when the developments in the Northwest Frontier Province, as it was then known, were on the lips of everybody in India. The Northwest Frontier Province saw the most active civil disobedience throughout the country. Uh, there was a large number of arrests. There was the Peshawar firings. There was, the refusal of soldiers to fire on unarmed troops. That famous incident which reverberated around the country. And there was a massacre which had taken place in Peshawar in April 1930, in which more than 200 people were killed. And this entire episode was something which was repeatedly inquired into. A committee was set up, headed by Vithalbhai Patel, to inquire into the Peshawar happenings. The report that was published was banned, and its circulation was also banned in 1930. It's a purely factual report based on evidence, and the evidence is recorded and tested by examination and so on. So it's all there in the Peshawar report. And incidentally, the whole sequence of events in Peshawar in April 1930 became one of the major lessons in non-violence that were
Oh, Anilji is frozen.
Sorry?
Oh, you froze for a moment.
Oh.
Sorry. Yeah.
Well, I was only saying that this incident of April 1930, in the course of the civil disobedience movement in the Northwest Frontier Province, it occurred as a sequel to the arrest of Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, whose influence in the province the government was keen to destroy. There is a passage in Jawaharlal Nehru's autobiography, which I'll read to you about what happened in the course of this movement. He said, in the frontier province, as in Bengal, the Delhi Pact, that is the 1931 pact between Gandhi and Irving, brought no peace. There was a permanent state of tension there, and government was a military affair with special laws and ordinances and heavy punishments for trivial offenses. To oppose this state of affairs, Abdul Ghaffar Khan led a great agitation, and he soon became a bugbear to the government. From village to village, he went striding along, carrying his 6'3" of Pathan manhood and establishing centers of the red shirts. Wherever he or his principal lieutenants went, they left a trail of their red shirts behind. And the whole province was soon covered by branches of the Khudai Kidmatgars. They were thoroughly peaceful. I repeat, they were thoroughly peaceful. And in spite of vague allegations, not a single definite charge of violence against them has been established. But whether they were peaceful or not, they had the tradition of war and violence behind them. and they lived near the turbulent frontier. And this rapid growth of a disciplined movement closely allied to the Indian national movement thoroughly upset the government.
So it seems
So
that,
this was,
go ahead.
yeah, so this was the crux, that this is the reason why NWFP, that is the Northwest Frontier Province, and the leadership provided by Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan and the organization of Khudai Kidmatgars became so important throughout the country, both for the Indian national movement and for the government, for opposite reasons.
Can you tell us a bit more about the relationship between Bad Shakhan and Gandhi? It's from what you're saying, this commitment to fierce nonviolent resistance is something that came to Bad Shakhan from his faith and from his own conscience. And then he met Gandhi. So then he must, and he found a brother in that fierce nonviolent resistance. And then a few years after he met Gandhi was when Khudai Kidmatgar was founded. So was there something in Gandhi's influence that led to this formal creation of the movement with a name, or was that just part of Bad Shakhan's own journey anyway? Do you have a sense from studying this history?
Well, one can speculate, but the point is that he um, wanted to conduct social reform, and he was um, not likely to be able to succeed if he had done it from a perspective other than from within the framework of religion. That is the reason for the name. The origin of the movement really lies in his educational programs. His emphasis on education, his going from village to village with his associates in uh, you know propagating the idea that people should set up their own schools, should give up what he considered arcane or evil practices, and so on. And the story of how, one story of how they came to be known as red shirts is that their clothes, which were in white initially, would get dirty when they would move from place to place. So they decided to use pine bark, the bark of the pine tree, to color it. And that turned out to be reddish. They used that, and that's how they came to be known as red shirts, you know. But that led to the propaganda against them that they were communists, which of course they were not, you know. But that in those days it was an addition, you know, there was this Meerut conspiracy case which was organized in North India by the administration. And the charge was merely, there was no charge of any overt action. The charge was simply that the persons concerned adhered to former Marxism. So, so to say to somebody that they were Reds in those days meant implicating them in some sort of Bolshevik activity, which of course was not Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan's method, because his methods were open.
Yes.
And there was nothing secretive about them, nothing furtive about them. And that's what brought him close to Gandhi, because that, you know, the affinity, the non-violence method of struggle.
Yes. I want to ask about, so I want to ask you to, if you can, paint us a picture of the Indian subcontinent, of the whole region during this pre-partition time, through Bad Shakhan's story and his eyes. So he was born and he passed away in Pakistan. He is considered an Indian freedom fighter and an Indian treasure. And he, as we know, he received the Bharat Ratna. I think it was a year before he passed away. and he was buried in Afghanistan. And so, and we know that he was vehemently opposed to the breaking up of this land, to partition.
Yeah.
So, and he moved throughout these lands which were one back then. So, can you tell us about that reality, which is so different to the one we are living in now?
Yes, he's a unifying figure actually, and a figure representing the composite culture of South Asia. Um, you know, there are so many examples that one can give of this. He, in his autobiography, he refers to the fact he's very proud of Bamyan, for instance, and the two large Buddhist statues which used to exist there,
which are no longer there.
And his autobiography is written in 1969, long before these statues were later destroyed. But his pride in the the culture of and the society and the social life of the people there, which is composite. It cuts across religion. When Gandhiji went there in 1938, there's a lovely photograph of Khan Abdul Khan and Gandhiji, and I think Prabhavati, Jayaprakash Narayan's wife, and Sushila Nair climbing up to Jolia. Jolia is a place near Taxila, where the Indo-Greek culture is represented through a number of statues and busts. There are some excavations and so on. So they together walked up that slope. It's quite a slope. I've been there. I went there in 1992, so I know. And it's a lovely photograph. So Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan was one who took pride in the composite culture of the country. And that is his remarkable characteristic. And of course, we should not forget that Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan was not just a leader of the Northwest Frontier Province, now known as Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, but of all India. So he is a household name across the country. He tours Bengal, for instance, in 1934, I think. And he, before he goes to Bengal, he has been to peasant rallies in Bardoli in 1931 and Bilga in Punjab in the same year. The rally in Bardoli is presided over by Kasturba Gandhi herself. The rally which Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan addresses in Punjab, a peasant rally, is attended by 100,000 peasants, way back in 1931. So this is, and in 1934, when he goes to, he tours Bengal, and he goes to the Comilla subdivision. He he talks about that in his speech at the Bombay session of the International Congress in 1934. And he's always been concerned about constructive work, setting up schools, removing social evils, and so on. So he talks about there was a big debate in those days about whether the national movement should focus on constructive work, that is on removal of untouchability, khadi, spinning, creating village industries which would be self-sufficient and so on, or focus on political work. And Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan makes the point that in the speech that it should be both. Yeah. That is his link with Gandhi also. That he says, and the reason he says is that when I toured Bengal, I found that where our constructive program had reached, and people were able to get if not 2 meals, at least 1 meal a day because of some enhancement in their earnings. People were willing to come to us and listen to us and receive our message. And where this constructive program had not reached, people were not willing to come to us. They were scared of us, or they maintained some sort of reserve. So he said, if you want to spread the message of Swaraj, you need to do the political work, but you also need to do this constructive work. And that's the connection he established between the two.
Yes.
So that
I
was,
wanted, yeah, go ahead. A few
yeah, so
years
I was
ago,
trying to make the point that
yeah,
he was a very large figure who had multifarious aspects and a multifaceted impact on the country.
yes,
He was somebody concerned with peasant issues also, and not just issues confined to his province, but throughout the country.
right. So yes, so a few years ago, I happened to be in India for a small course on Gandhi in Kodaikanal, and the people came from mostly South India, but a few, people came from different parts of South India to come to to learn in this course. And there was an age range. And something that was very surprising to me is two things. One is there were several of the students who came who actually had not heard of Ambedkar. And I didn't, and these were Indians, and I was, surprised about that. And now, in preparing for this conversation with you, I realized that that entire course, which was 3 days long, didn't even mention Bad Shakhan. And as a person who is so steeped in this history and cares so much about this history and legacy of our nation, what is happening in education, so that, I understand that you and Rajmohan Gandhi, and there are people who are, and Faisal Khan and all of his comrades are trying to lift up this history because we need to know it for today. But what is your feeling about the way history is taught, and these great figures in our history we are reminded of them, especially in schools and so forth. Do you have some thoughts about this?
Well, yes, I do feel that we should try and uh, encourage our students, especially at the university level, to make their own inquiries apart from the usual syllabus, because the syllabus is set by somebody who may or may not have an agenda, somebody who's looking at things in a particular way. So if you really want to learn about history, I think one has to take an interest beyond the syllabus and read things, read the papers of those times, read some of the old documents. Always try and go to the original sources and question. Now, even Dalit leaders, there were thousands of Dalits who went to prison in struggles led by Gandhiji. Uh, Chaudhry Bihari Lal, Jaglal Chaudhry. Chaudhry Bihari Lal was a great Dalit leader from UP. Jaglal Chaudhry was a very big leader in Bihar. These people are also not being written about. So it's not as if the Dalit movement as a whole is being written about. Uh, you know, it's some people get written about for a while, then they get sidelined and they get forgotten. So, and then it also depends upon who is in power and who is pushing it and so on. Now, in fact, you raised this point because I wanted to mention it, that there was this whole interaction with the Northwest Frontier Province in Hana, Abdul, Ghaffar Khan, the Khudai Kidmatgars. It was not just Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan coming to the rest of India and speaking and getting known. it was also the rest of India going there. For instance, you had, apart from visits by Gandhi and Nehru and so on, Khurshid Nauroji was sent to NWFP by Gandhiji, and she got arrested and she spent time in Peshawar jail. Khurshid Nauroji was Dadabhai Nauroji's granddaughter. Now you don't hear of Khurshid Nauroji either,
Yeah.
but these are the sort of people who need to be written about, and I do hope that there will be some effort to do this. In fact, while reading about Khurshid Nauroji, I found similarities to a large extent with Faisal's matter, because Khurshid Nauroji, when in the 1940s, she went to NWFP and got arrested. But the message which she had taken to NWFP was a sequel to the Bannu raids. You know, in 1938, there were some dacoities and raids in Bannu, in NWFP. And she had gone to spread the message of non-violence in, in that area. And she gets arrested. Now, Gandhiji writes about that, Khurshid Ben Nauroji, this is August 1941. I'll just read a passage, if I may.
Sure.
Khurshid Ben Nauroji is the youngest granddaughter of the late Grand Old Man of India. That is, everybody knew who GOM of India meant, Dadabhai Nauroji. Khurshid Ben Nauroji is the youngest granddaughter of the late GOM of India. In common with her other sisters, she has dedicated herself to the service of India in truth of humanity. This is Khudai Kidmatgars work. She felt the call some years ago to go to the frontier province and work among the Pathans there. Kidnappings, you know, the Bannu affairs. She's a brave and fearless woman, and so she had planned to work if she could, even in the tribal area, and come in contact with the dacoits and wean them from their error. For months she worked within the province and was trying to cross the border with the permission of the government, but she did not get the permission. Though the authorities with whom she came into contact recognized her worth, transparent honesty, and utter absence of secrecy. Faisal,
Yes.
about her, the authorities with whom she came into contact recognized her work, transparent honesty, and utter absence of secrecy about her movements in the frontier province. This is clear from the letter she holds from the officials themselves. Being tired of waiting, she notified the frontier government of her intention to cross the border. But she was arrested, tried, and sentenced to a fine of rupees 100 or imprisonment for 3 months in default thereof. She preferred the latter, and on her finishing the term of imprisonment, she was externed from the frontier province and interned in the island of Bombay. She protested against the order and corresponded with the authorities, and I give below her letter. So then he goes on to say how she was kept in the Peshawar Central Jail and so on, and also subsequent events which will take too long to go into. But I'm just making the point that there are these figures who created the bonds between NWFP and the rest of India. Hana Farka coming over here, being involved in the various movements here. People from here going there. Maniben Patel went there in the 1936, Sardar Patel's daughter. She went to NWFP to campaign in 1936. And there are so many, Jawaharlalji went there, Jawaharlal Nehru so many times.
I want to talk about, sorry.
Asaf Ali went there to inquire into the, I mentioned the inquiry which Vithalbhai Patel's committee conducted, the Peshawar firings in 1930. Asaf Ali went there to inquire into the Bannu raids in 1938. There's a very comprehensive report about that. Warrior Elvin was sent by Gandhiji to the NWFP to inquire into atrocities in the civil disobedience movement. And there is a small report by Warrior Elvin about it. So, NWFP was very central to the entire national movement.
One thing that keeps coming up in the history is, of course, people being in prison, for being jailed for their resistance. And Bad Shakhan spent almost a third of his life in prison. And the other day when you and Rajmohan Gandhi were talking, it was really striking. I think I don't remember which one of you, maybe Rajmohan ji mentioned that Bacha Khan was one of the freedom fighters that didn't necessarily write while he was in prison.
Yes,
and then there was this beautiful image of gardening that he did while he was in prison. And then that just made me think, what a different day we are in today. Can you imagine we have all of these prisoners of conscience now, including now Faisal Bhai, although I hope he's out soon. It just doesn't seem like a day when prisoners can be gardening while they're inside. I just wanted to ask you about this. It's just a different spirit, that we are living, a zeitgeist that we're living in, and something about that difference of those times and these times. While there was brutality, maybe, I don't know, when people were in prison, maybe it wasn't the situation that we are seeing today, perhaps. Maybe there was a bit more, maybe people were treated with dignity while they were inside prison, especially freedom fighters. It's a question, I don't know. But what if you spend a third of your life in prison, what does that do to you? What was the impact on his being of spending this many years, something like 35 years behind bars or under house arrest?
Well, to begin with the conditions in prisons in British India, it varied. Initially, when the mass movement started around 1919, the conditions were extremely severe. And it is with time, when the national movement grew in scale and the atmosphere in the country changed, and the British government also realized that anything that is done gets wide publicity, and you come to know that some restrictions got relaxed. But still they were very severe, even in the 40s, when, for instance, when Gandhiji was in prison, there were restrictions on who he could write to, how many letters he could write, things like that. With Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, and there were severe restrictions. There were fetters were placed on his feet. In the earlier, in fact, the fetters were too small for him. He was for his feet, yeah. So he in that period, 1919, 1921, and so on, they tried placing fetters on his feet. So these are the conditions they went through. And there were solitary confinements. There was rigorous imprisonment often. And again, with Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, the cycle was repeated, because in undivided India, the conditions, there was a sort of relaxing of the stricter or the worse prison conditions got improved with time, with each movement, depending on who you were, not for all. But in Pakistan, when Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan was arrested again in 1948 and then suffered one long stretch of repeated imprisonments till about 1954, his imprisonment was rigorous imprisonment for a man of his age. So, and that got relaxed over time in his subsequent imprisonments as he grew older. And his condition started attracting worldwide attention, that then the government relaxed its. So that is the usual story with governments, that when something starts being written about and people start talking about it, then they start relaxing a bit. And of course, there are others who don't get written about and who continue to suffer difficult conditions. So it varies.
And this is a message to us, all of us, to keep raising our voice about today's
Absolutely, yes,
prisoner.
absolutely, yes. The more
Um,
we know about it, the more we talk about it. It's absolutely vital for the liberty of the individual.
yes. I want to ask about bringing the story to our times a bit more. I recently, after the murder of George Floyd here in this country, I was asking myself questions about nonviolent resistance. Because this country was, just about every city in the States had protests, and sometimes there were violent aspects in those protests. So I spoke to Faisal Bhai in India, but I also spoke to nonviolent resistors in Palestine, in Kashmir, and in Afghanistan. And it was quite wonderful that each one of them, when I asked about who was their influence, each one of them separately and without any, I didn't plan it this way, they all mentioned Bad Shakhan.
That's so
And
remarkable.
especially the movement in Afghanistan, it's called the People's Peace Movement. They are not educated. They're from the south of Afghanistan. They are Pashtuns. That's probably part of it. But it was just these are brave people, men and women. And they have been walking across the country, sometimes into Taliban territory, just to say enough war, we want peace, we don't care about the politics, and their
Yes,
influence is Badshah Khan. So, and then I was thinking, being in the States, we have this wonderful civil rights movement. The history that we have here was influenced in part. Martin Luther King Jr. was influenced by Gandhi, and so Badshah Khan is part of that influence
yes.
because they cannot be separated. So I was just wondering if you can tell us about what you see through Khudai Kidmatgar, the movement, Faisal Bhai, and all of the Khudai Kidmatgars, and the legacy of the original nonviolent resistors. Where do you see this method of resistance alive? And what do you see as the relevance of nonviolent resistance today in the too many conflict zones of our world?
To take the first part of the question, the affinities are obvious. That Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan is using the framework of religion to widen the rights of the people. The same framework can be used to diminish the rights of the people. So that's a very major difference between what is happening in various parts of the world today and the movement which was led by uh, Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan in his part of the world. The affinities with the US civil rights movement, one can notice in the fact that even in the US movement, much of the initial impetus comes from within the church. That it is you, which means that you do not exclude the religious sphere.
Yeah.
You use the religious sphere to widen the scope for action and to widen the freedom of the citizen to go beyond that sphere, and encourage freedom of action and freedom of expression. So it is, uh, even in South Africa, there was many people like Desmond Tutu and so on came from that. And even in our own movement, many of the people Gandhi connected with uh, among the British, like C.F. Andrews and W.W. Pearson, were people who originally emerged from this, from the the religious stream. So I do believe that one one key to the success of any movement is that it must uh, not go by the label, but must dominate all spheres of life. That is, it must expand the good in every sphere of life and not cut up life into compartments and say that we are only going to work in this field, and or um, contrariwise not use any compartment of the sphere of life to diminish other spheres or to diminish freedoms and diminish other scope for people to grow and develop and fully express themselves. So it is actually the larger purpose that you have in mind that is important, and that is what unites people like Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, Gandhi, and the US civil rights movement.
That's beautiful. I just want to do a time check for people. I'm going to ask one more question, and you can also, when I ask the question, you can also add anything that I haven't asked. And then if people who are listening want to ask a few questions, we can take a little bit of time, and please just put your questions into the chat, and I'll read them out. For Anilji. So I just want to bring it back to India and back to the fact that our brother who revived Khudai Kidmatgar in 2011 is today behind bars. So this is today's India, and all he did was pray. And this is very painful for me and so many of us. And whenever I try to talk with Faisal Bhai about today's polarized India, the state of democracy, the state of human rights, he always steers the conversation back to, he takes it away from politics and comes back to sort of what you were just saying about the need to, to just be humane and to talk about humanity and mobilizing youth with love. This is what he talks about. And now he is in jail. And but hopefully we have positive news, and so we must have hope for him. But I just want to end by asking, what is your outlook for India? You've talked about your outlook for this kind of a nonviolent resistance methodology in India and the world, but and therefore Khudai Khidmatgar, but India itself. How are you feeling? You're in India right now, and everything that I am, hearing about, you are living through. So please tell us what you're concerned about, and also where your hope lies.
Yeah, so well, there are two things that I would like to mention. One I had mentioned in the conversation I had with Professor Rajmohan Gandhi, which is that people like Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan and Gandhi, they were struggling for democratic rights, not just for the freedom of an area, not just for independence of India, but for democratic rights of the citizen. The entire struggle against the Rowlatt legislation in 1919, in which Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan was imprisoned. Gandhi was also arrested when he tried to enter Punjab and taken to Bombay. This entire struggle is against a legislation which is destructive of democratic rights of the citizen, which denies judicial redress, which allows arbitrary detentions. And the Frontier Crimes Regulation of 1901, which is still in force in that part of the country, in that part of South Asia. And similar laws with varying degrees of severity exist in other parts of South Asia, including India. These are laws against which Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan and Gandhi struggled. He is very critical. Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan is very critical in his autobiography of the Frontier Crimes Regulation, and he refers to how Section 40 and other sections of this, he himself was arrested under it, and how these sections were used to harass ordinary people who were detained and arrested for no crime whatsoever, but simply because they were. He said that, you know, even if you're walking down the street, somebody can pick you up and say that, all right, now you give security for such and such behavior, and until you do that, you'll be in prison. And you know, the Frontier Crimes Regulation permitted imprisonment for up to 3 years if you fail to give security, and this could be repeated endlessly. So these are the sort of things these people fought against. The other thing I would like to say is that Khudai Khidmatgar, though it sounds like a religious organization, it is involved in much wider reform activities, not just matters concerning religion. It, by Khudai Khidmatgar, is meant service of humanity, which uh, which is seen by this worldview as service of God, which is exactly what C.F. Andrews, another associate of Gandhi, is saying in his work Christ and Labor and so on, that this is, you know, when you serve for the downtrodden, that is service of humanity, and that he sees as service of God. So he was known as Deen Bandhu, C.F. Andrews. And
This is in
Gandhi's
Gandhi's talisman, the same.
same. And Daridra Narayan was the word for God which Gandhi used. So now this is one aspect. The other is that both Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan and Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru and others, they allowed for religious freedom of religious expression subject to the overall human rights framework. But that did not mean that they did not subscribe to the concept of a secular state. So Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan was present at the Karachi session of the Indian National Congress, you know, in 1931, when the Indian National Congress passed a resolution saying that the state in independent India would be religiously neutral. Now, this is a resolution which was drafted by Gandhi and Nehru, and which was passed in the Karachi session, which was presided over by Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, who was Congress president at the time. And it was a session attended by Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, the Frontier Gandhi. And, the session was preceded by the procession of red shirts, incidentally, the Khudai Kidmatgars. They led the procession which preceded the session at Karachi, and leading to this famous resolution. So all these people believed in a concept of a secular state in which the state would be secular. That is, it would be secular in the sense of being religiously neutral. And the citizens would have a full right of freedom of expression so long as they did not impinge on each other. So that's the broad concept. And I think they all subscribe to it. And we can't move away from that. So your question was, what is the outlook for us? Well, the outlook is that within the democratic rights framework, which we defend, which these great figures in our history defended, uh, we work for freedom also of the citizen in all their aspects, including the right to free development of their mind and expression.
Yes, I mean, I have to press you because it's not. I don't see it happening, and of course, there are brave people who are standing up, but being from the Hindu majority community, it's very disheartening. And whether it's in the States or in England or in India itself, the Hindu diaspora, Indian and outside India, just don't know if there's a sense. I don't know if it's that people don't know and haven't yet woken up, or if people are willfully supporting what's going on. It's hard to tell, but I just want to ask you to say more about
Yes,
what
there
we
are
should all be doing.
two things I want to emphasize here, and both draw upon the experience of the Khudai Kidmatgars um, as well, and you could relate it also to the Khudai Kidmatgars led by Faisal today. The point is that the reason why our secular and democratic framework seems to be in crisis is that firstly, it is possible that the uh, once the constitution came into force and the state, the independent states came into being in India, the independent state of Republic of India, we assumed that setting up a secular constitution was all that was required, that we did not need to conduct a social movement simultaneously in defense of the vision, the enlightened vision which the national movement had projected. So it was assumed that this, once the state had been established and was being run on those lines, that would be sufficient. So many movements which had been dominant in the national movement, receded from the task of influencing also the religious sphere. So the religious sphere was sort of abandoned uh, to influences which were not necessarily positive or constructive. And this is one aspect which I think organizations like Faisal Khan's were attending to and are attending to. So this means that these kind of organizations need to expand their activities and need to mushroom actually, and they need our support. That's one aspect. The other is the part of the constructive work which Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan referred to in his speech at the Bombay session of the Indian National Congress in 1934, when he gives the example which I mentioned of his tour of Bengal and says that you must keep doing your constructive work. That is, you must, all those multifarious activities which you must do simultaneously with the political work. Setting up schools, running campaigns against social evils, untouchability, and so on, and work for village industries, regenerating the rural economies, which we see today, the crisis in the agricultural sector. So all these things, if one does not do simultaneously, then uh, that gap is filled by others in a not necessarily in a productive or constructive way. So I think these are the two major things we need to attend to. And it is possible that the results will not be immediate. The mass national movement, which started from 1919 onwards in the 20th century, in 20th century South Asia. I'm saying that it reminds me of something which I'll just come to. But this mass movement, which started in 1919, it took 3 decades before it reached a conclusion. So it's not going to be easy. We'll have to start afresh, and we'll have to put in a lot of effort. And maybe we'll be lucky if we see quick results, but we should be ready to, we should understand that it could be a long struggle. The other point which I would like to mention, since I just spoke of the mass movement in South Asia from 1919 onwards, in one of his speeches in Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, when he speaks in Pakistan, when he's accused of being against Pakistan and so on. So he makes a very interesting point. He said, look, this freedom which you have in Pakistan, this independence that you got from the British, do you think you do not owe it to the national struggle which was started by us from that period onwards? It is to that struggle that you owe your own freedom as well. Partition is a different matter, but the freedom of India and Pakistan has to be attributed to the struggle for freedom that was conducted under the leadership. Yeah, correct.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
So he put that point across in several of his speeches when he was told. These allegations were thrown at him that he was against Pakistan. So I think he made that point very effectively in some of his court speeches he makes in court and in parliamentary forums like the Constituent Assembly as well.
And that unity that you're describing, and just the way in those freedom struggle times, there were these connections and partnerships and echoes between movements in different parts of the world that we hope will continue by people in different countries supporting and amplifying resistance that's happening in India and vice versa. And hopefully this conversation is one small part of that. I know that our organization and so many that we work with are just on standby to do whatever is needed to be in solidarity with our brothers and sisters in India itself. So this has been such an honor and a pleasure.
It was a great pleasure and honor for me as well.
And I can keep asking you my questions after the public conversation, but I would love for some of our listeners to ask questions. If there's any, we can take just 1 or 2, perhaps, because we've gone over the hour. Is there anybody with a question for Anilji? There's no questions yet. We've been so comprehensive and thorough.
You're looking at these questions in your chat.
Yeah, I'm not seeing any. So
and
there must be one question.
And what about Facebook?
That I don't have. I'm not looking at Facebook. If anybody sees questions on Facebook, can they just put it into the chat in Zoom? Okay, that's fine. I guess we'll close. Is there anything else you want to share?
I just wanted to say something about his, 1969, when Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan came to this part of South Asia for the centenary of Mahatma Gandhi's birth, which was being celebrated in that year. There were some intercommunal troubles at the time in Gujarat particularly. Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, uh, I was at school, but I remember this very vividly. Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan chastised all of us, all Indians, for the way they had allowed these things to happen. And it's amazing how the whole country listened without resentment because of the great respect this man was held in. You know, when I recall it, I get moved that this man could, he commanded such respect and he had such great stature that when he criticized all of us, you know, for having allowed this sort of uh, atmosphere to develop, the whole country listened to him respectfully. There was not a word. There might have been some, I remember seeing some newspaper editorial saying that, oh, he's a guest and so on. But I think the people realized that they were listening to a person, to a titan of their own freedom struggle. You know, they'd come on seeing him come to India for the first time, come to this part of South Asia for the first time after freedom. It was as though we were seeing our freedom struggle face to face. And for, you know, and it was an experience I find it very difficult to forget. And then, of course, there was this aspect that he would carry his own luggage, you know. People rushed to carry his bedding. He had a bedroll, and people rushed to carry it for him. And he said, no, we are freedom fighters of the Gandhian mold, and we carry our own luggage.
Our own. That's wonderful. I wonder if there's a video recording of this talk. That might be a lovely thing to share somehow. We can look, we can search for it. There is a question from Facebook. It doesn't say who asked it, but it says, my question is why Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan chose to stay in Pakistan after independence. He believed in Gandhi, was an ally of Indian National Congress, though he felt betrayed after INC decided to go with the two-nation theory. So the question is, why didn't he stay in India?
Well, let me reverse the question. First of all, let me correct them. Nobody, the Congress did not go with the two-nation theory. They did not accept, they rejected the two-nation theory. They accepted partition, but the territorial partition, but they did not accept the two-nation theory because the Congress insisted that India would be a composite nation. Hindus and Muslims were no separate nations. So India, the Congress and India did not accept the two-nation theory. On the question why Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan did not live in India, well, his home was in the Northwest Frontier Province, and he was not required to leave his home, and he had the courage to face the new situation very boldly, and he faced it. And you know, the story that we have been through today about his various imprisonments, pre-freedom and post-freedom, are a testament to that story, that, you know, what he faced as a result. The question of why he didn't live in India, actually Gandhiji wanted to go and live in that part of South Asia, you know, and he was making plans to go there. And then he was assassinated. So I think both Gandhi and the frontier Gandhi, Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, were greatly troubled by this separation that had taken place between the two parts of an undivided subcontinent.
And wasn't
Also,
he in jail for 12 years after partition in Pakistan? Is that true?
yes, he was in jail for or house arrest for a very long time. I have not worked out the exact figure, but you may well be right. It may be 12 years if you count the house arrest uh, bit also. And it was not his option to come this side, but he certainly spent a lot of his time whenever he could in Afghanistan. And he was welcomed there as a great hero there as well. Um, so the whole of South Asia was his home.
Thank you. So I think we are now, we've been talking for an hour and 15 minutes, and it's just flown by. And it's been just, you've made the history, real in front of our eyes. Thank you so
It was a
much.
pleasure.
And
Thank you.
the
You're kind.
conversation will continue among all of us we
Yes,
must keep this history alive in our families and communities. It's essential for
yes,
all of us.
yes,
So
indeed. And before we part, I just want to mention one more name. There was Abdul Samad Khan in Baluchistan, who was known as the Baluch Gandhi, and who was assassinated in Pakistan in 1973. And also, by the way, Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan's elder brother, Dr. Khan Sahib, who was also an ardent freedom fighter and congressman. He had been the premier of NWFP twice. He was assassinated, I think, in 1958 in Lahore. Um, so, they went through a very bad time. Our freedom fighters.
yeah, that's right. Well, thank you. And before we part, would you tell us the name of the autobiography of Bad Shakhan and where we can find it? Because I was looking online and I couldn't, it's not easily found.
Can you see this? Is this visible?
Uh,
It's My Life and Struggle, autobiography of Badshah Khan, uh, My Life and Struggle. It was dictated to KB Narang, who was a legislator and freedom fighter in the Northwest Frontier Province, and it is published. This copy which I have is published by Hind Pocket Books Private
Hind,
Limited.
Hind?
Yes, Hind Pocket Books Private Limited, Delhi. It is published in 1969. I'm sure you will be able to find copies in some library or the other.
Okay.
This is a translation by, let me tell you.
What did he write it in? Hindi or Pashto?
I think he dictated it in Pashto originally. I'm not sure of that. But this was translated by a lady called Helen H. Bauman, Bouman. It's a very good translation. Apparently, it reads quite well in English.
I will look for it. So thank you, Anilji.
Thank you
it's
so much.
wonderful, and I hope the listeners have enjoyed this conversation as much as I have.